Okay, so I've put together a little presentation about how, different ways that you can tell your story and different ideas if you don't know where to start on how to tell, researchers and caregivers in the community who you are and why paying attention to lipodystrophy is really important. So the theme of today is how to tell your story, why, and where. So I'll go through these different topics, the impact that telling a story can have. This isn't, just something that will be told once and, never be listened to again. With your consent, it's something that could be posted on the Lou website and be accessed by so many people who are, either our patients themselves and want to join this community, or researchers who are considering a rare disease to research and, might listen to your story and become inspired to, take lipodystrophy as a research area. There's a lot of different ways that it can have an impact and a lot of different ways that impact can look, which I'll talk about. Also, how to identify what you want to say. Like that first slide said, telling your lipodystrophy story is a huge, huge category. It can be really overwhelming to figure out what part of your story you want to share, what part you're comfortable sharing. And so I'll talk a little bit about how to figure out exactly what you want to say and how specifying it like that can make your story more powerful. Ingredients for a good story, why medium is important. I'm going to be talking primarily today about how to tell your story for that 3-minute video format, but there's a million different ways you can tell your story, including through photography, through writing blog posts, through art, so many different ways. And I know that Kate is very receptive to different community ideas. And this is a place where creativity and your voices are really valued. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then again, why telling your story is particularly important now. So a little bit about me. So I work in local news, which means that I get to meet different people every day in Austin. I have a degree in journalism from Boston University, where in a lot of my classes, I specialized in narrative nonfiction, which means telling true stories in a very compelling, a compelling scenes-driven way in order to hook people into a story as if they're reading a book and usually compel them to act or change or think differently about something. Um, and then you are the expert in your story. That's something I'll be saying a lot today to remind you. But what I can help with is prompts, story forming, story information, inspiration, and empowerment. And if anything I say here doesn't serve you, don't feel like you have to take it and edit your story in that way. These are all just suggestions based on my experience that can help with making a particularly powerful story. So the most important thing, which I have in the Lou red color, is we can never underestimate how powerful a story is at communicating to someone you are not alone, especially when it pertains to an illness like lipodystrophy that is incredibly rare. I know that so many of you, I expect, have probably felt isolated at times, especially when you didn't know what was going on before you had your diagnosis. And for someone to be able to access someone's story about any aspect of lipodystrophy and how it's impacted your life is very valuable at just letting them know that they're not alone and that there is support for them, whether in Lou, whether in potential clinical trials, research, etc. Um, it also can encourage more nuanced perspectives among particularly researchers and doctors, though also among caregivers. All of your experiences are different. No matter what type of lipodystrophy you have, there are so many factors that impact the care and support and access you're able to receive when you have lipodystrophy. And the more people that share their story, the more ways that researchers and doctors will be able to understand the whole community and not look at lipodystrophy with kind of a narrow lens of understanding. So broadening that understanding is very valuable from a researcher perspective and from a caregiver and patient perspective too. It raises awareness too. Kate and I have talked about how everybody knows about ALS because of the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. Telling your stories is a way for lipodystrophy to gain name recognition. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, but the more stories that are out there, the more avenues for people to empathize and care and get involved with lipodystrophy, which is obviously really important, especially as Lou is restarting again. And there's like so many different ways that people can get involved and help. And it'll help other patients realize how valuable the Lou community is, and how it can help them. Again, speaking to the isolation that a lot of people feel. So the other thing in the vein of this is your story, I want you all to think for a second, and you can jot it down if you want, but why you want to tell your story. You guys showed up today, all showed up today. Thank you so much. And I think that knowing why you want to tell your story is really important. It's something I think about a lot when I'm interviewing people. Do people want to tell me their story because they want to see a change? Are people telling me their story because they have because it was a particularly emotional experience, they don't want other people to feel alone. There's a million different reasons why you want to tell your story, but for you as the storyteller, understanding why you want to tell your story will help you know how to shape it and know what impact you want to leave the audience with. So here are some examples of reasons to tell your story. One thing that I didn't talk about yet that I think is really important is eradicating shame. Um, Shame is often something we carry with stuff that we don't talk about. And so by bringing to light uncomfortable parts of having lipodystrophy or particularly emotional parts, or hard moments that you all have gone through can help other people know that they're not alone and help eradicate that shame that people carry. And I think that's a really important part too. Even if you don't think that you're an inspiring person, by telling your story, you oftentimes inspire others just to know that they're not alone and that they belong in a community that can help them. So the goal, 3-minute video to be recorded at the symposium. This video will be filmed there, and then these are the different things it can be used for. But it's important to you all to know that it will only be used with your consent. So you don't have to worry about, an unknown audience accessing it, because Kate will keep you posted every step of the way with what she would like to do with the video, and you will always have the agency to say, yes, of course, share my story, or maybe you can share part of it, or I want it to be used for that, but not this. So like I mentioned, Lou's website, it could be shared as a package of story with researchers, again, to show that breadth of the lipodystrophy experience. And it could be potentially, in a newsletter or on social media. So those are some places that your story can have reach. And the more places your story is and the more that you're comfortable getting it out there, the more eyes on it and the more potential help and awareness that can come from it. But your comfort is absolutely the most important thing, and your agency will always be top priority. So, pivoting to the more technical elements of what is, a story. In 3 minutes, how do I tell not a speech, not a lecture, not a bullet list of everything I've gone through, but a story? Um, so here is something that you may have seen before. I remember seeing it when I was in elementary school, but we talked about it a lot at the college story level too. This is a good but not foolproof model of how a story can flow. I say that because your story can look totally different than this. This is a rule that can be broken, but it's a good guideline for pacing if you're kind of stuck on how to make sure that you are that you're telling something that is a story and successfully fits into that 3 minutes. Um, so inciting incident, particularly with a video, it can help to get right to the action of a story. So I'll talk about scenes later, but maybe talking about a moment or a memory you have with lipodystrophy that relates to your experience. to, get people right in the action. And then Kate has said it's very important that every video talks to some extent about how lipodystrophy has impacted you. And so I built that into this with, after the inciting incident, maybe you could talk about, maybe it's about diagnosis. That was the example I used yesterday. So maybe the inciting incident is you have an unexplained symptom, and the build is talking to different doctors and they're not able to help you. And you're kind of living in this confusion of what's going on and why am I being treated this way by the medical system. And the climax can be finally getting that diagnosis, maybe. It's basically when, if the inciting incident raises some kind of question or problem, the climax is where there's a realization or the problem is solved. So this might be finally getting that diagnosis. And then, of course, all good stories don't end right there. And then I got the diagnosis. Like, no, people want to hear about like what happened after that, like why that moment was important. So that's kind of the come down from the roller coaster. And then the end, which I'll talk more about because that can be a part of stories that people struggle with. But it can end with like some kind of reflection, action item. A good way of framing it, especially thinking about researchers maybe being part of the audience, is one of your hopes for the future, something you wish you had had to help you through your journey, something you hope the next generation has. Um, that can be a good place to kind of sum up your story and end. So that's an example of one potentially useful model. Important qualities in a story. These are really important to like in those using the best of the 3 minutes and making sure that you're telling something that's clear and concise while still remaining powerful and true to your story. Focus is really important. One thing I struggled with in school is I wanted to say everything in an essay, but focus,
Okay.
narrowing it down to one thing you want to say, is really important. Oh, did somebody unmute? Okay, no, I think I'm just hearing things. Clarity and direction is really important, kind of like that roller coaster. This is where I start, where do I want to go? Scenes, they're really powerful at getting people in a story and being able to relate immediately to what's going on or understand difference really well. Maybe you're talking about grocery shopping or going to the gym and struggle you've had there. And somebody can watch that story and be like, oh, I go to the grocery store, I go to the gym. I've never had to think about that. And that can help them understand part of the lipodystrophy experience more. So that's an example of how scenes can be powerful. Emotion, and I'll talk more about this, but that doesn't mean that it has to be sad or dramatic. But having, you know, and allowing yourself to put how you felt in the story can be empowering from the storyteller perspective, and it can also make your story especially compelling. Um, Again, a question I want to leave you with to think about is what is your story specifically? Not the story of what it means to have lipodystrophy or a rare disease or be an advocate, but what is your story as it relates to lipodystrophy? And what do you want people to walk away with when they finish watching the video? So, themes or focus. These are some examples of themes that I quickly wrote up. Community could be a theme. Ability, whether something you can do because of lipodystrophy. Somebody yesterday was talking about gymnastics as an ability, or something you can't do because of lipodystrophy that maybe, people don't know that well. Body image is a big one. Your process with diagnosis, that example I used, and some of the symptoms you deal with on a daily basis. It could also be mental health and how having lipodystrophy has impacted your mental health and how you've persevered. You could talk about a person that you've leaned on during this and why they were so important to you as you went through this. And maybe the end of that could be like, I wish we lived in a world where everyone was as understanding when it comes to rare diseases. Um, and that we're all working to fix this so we don't feel alone. Maybe that could be a way. And then hopes for the future. I think that that's a really important too because the direction that you care about and your hopes for the future will help inform researchers' hopes for the future, and the direction that this community can go as it pertains to changing um, lipodystrophy as a whole. Clarity is also really important. So the audience, like we talked about, will probably be researchers, fellow patients, and caregivers. So thinking about direction, these are some examples of potential directions you could take instead of trying to be all of them in one story. You could think about what you would want to teach people about your experience having like lipodystrophy. You could think about maybe talking about an example where you persevered or overcame something really hard with lipodystrophy or something you struggle with that you can overcome and how that impacts your life. You could talk about something you've learned that's inspired you, that maybe will inspire other people, or you could be an advocate and, talk about what is something this community needs. Those are all different directions that your story can take, and there's a million other as well. But thinking about direction in addition to your theme and focus is really important. So, scenes, there we go. Um, what is an example from your life that can best show your experience with lipodystrophy or with Lou? When I ask that question, if there's a memory that comes to mind or a moment, I'd like you to write it down or remember it. Because what I've learned from talking with people and from telling stories and interviewing people is that what memories are important to a storyteller are almost always important to the audience. Our brain knows what's important because that's what we remember. And trusting yourself as a storyteller, and not overthinking it is almost always the best way to tell your story. And so you should pay attention to memories that are coming up and moments that are coming up because they can lead, be a spark that leads to a really great story. Emotion. What emotions come to mind when you think about lipodystrophy and Lou? I'll let you think about this for a second because if some emotions immediately came to mind, maybe some others are trickling in that you don't think about as much. Maybe resilience is one. Maybe strength. Um, there's so many different ones. Maybe empathy. Maybe you're a more empathetic person because of it. And it, like I was saying before, there's so many more emotions than sadness, in a life. So here are some questions, especially if you want to steer away from a more emotional story. What is something people would be surprised about having lipodystrophy that they might not know about it, especially for people or researchers who may have not really heard about lipodystrophy and are coming at it, watching these stories because they're curious and want to learn more. What was it like to meet the first person who understood you and listened to you? This could be a doctor, this could be a friend, a parent, a partner, and maybe you found support in other ways. But what was it like to find the support? And, you know, in a perfect world, what should support look like for the lipodystrophy community? What is fill in the blank like with lipodystrophy? I think what is dating like with lipodystrophy would be a great story. What is parenting like, working like? I think those are great ways to put someone immediately into your shoes, especially when talking about something that um, a lot of different people do in their lives. What was it like learning how to be a self-advocate? Or what are some other skills or interests or hobbies that you have because of lipodystrophy? How has lipodystrophy made you a better friend or a better partner, I mean, we said advocate, but there's a million other things. That could be a great way to tell people your story too. And along the lines of like what comforted you during this experience, is there a song or a piece of media that you leaned on during really hard times? And why did it resonate with you? For example, maybe you watched a sitcom like Friends a lot when you were so tired that you couldn't leave your bed. And maybe somebody watches this video and says, "Oh my gosh, I watched Friends." I know why it was important to me, and then they can understand your experience through that. These are all different ways of getting at what is the experience of lipodystrophy without just going to one formula, because there's a million different ways you can tell your story. And I wrote this slide to kind of challenge us to think about all the different emotions and ways that you guys can tell your story, and to really think about what you want to say and what you're comfortable saying. Personal. Um, I think this to me means that a story is honest, individual, and that it's meaningful to you. When you're writing your story, or because it's spoken to, you don't necessarily have to write it. But when you're thinking about what you want to say, it's important to think about what you want to leave the audience with. But I think it's even more important to think about um like what's important to you to share, not what you think people want to hear. And I think that that's something to keep you grounded if you're feeling like frustrated with telling your story or not knowing where to say, what is meaningful to me, or what would be meaningful to me, if before your diagnosis, what would have been a meaningful message to hear before, you like 10 years ago, what would have want to hear from someone with lipodystrophy? I think those are really important things to keep in mind. And I wrote this in red, and I'm gonna read it because I think it's important. When you think about your story, you should always remember that it is your story. No one gets to tell you what you need to say or how to say it. You should feel empowered to own your story as well. Storytelling can be a powerful way to make peace with pain and to find a way forward. I want to, as you're approaching this 3-minute video, I think it's an opportunity to think about how telling your story can help you, and think about what you want to say, especially because with the symposium, you'll have this platform to really, be it in that community and to tell your story in a super safe environment, which I think is really important. I was saying yesterday, when I was doing this presentation, if somebody asks you like, "Oh, how are you?" Like if a stranger asks you that, you might just say, "Oh, I'm okay, thanks," or "I'm good." But if your best friend or your sister calls you and says, "How are you?" you're gonna tell them every detail of your day and the ups and downs, and, "Oh, I ran into traffic. Oh, like I made a great lunch." Like the stories we feel comfortable telling are very contextual. And so knowing that you're in a safe environment where this story will never be used without your consent, and where you'll be telling it at the symposium surrounded by so many people who have very similar experiences to you, can be a way to really embrace telling your story exactly how you want to tell it. How do I end my story? These are just a few examples. And the end might come naturally to you. I've met writers who really struggle with beginnings, but always know what they're going to say at the end. I'm the opposite. I usually struggle with the end. But I think, ending on hopes for the future, or an action item that people can take. What you think the Lou community needs, or what you wish you had had. What you would say to yourself 10 years ago. When you may have been feeling XYZ before you knew you had lipodystrophy, what advice you would give yourself. But you still carry too, because obviously our stories are not complete. And some of the struggles you guys may be facing aren't going to go away overnight, and they're not going to go away. They may not go away when you're telling the story. So I think being honest about what you still carry is a really powerful way to end your story. And then also what you have learned and gained from the Lou community. That's very valuable, especially for if the video is going to be used on the website, and can be a nice way to think about the community you're a part of and the community that this story will join. Okay, maybe I've convinced you and you want to tell your story. Here are some steps to like get into it. And again, everyone's process is different. I know some people who can just sit in front of a camera and do it, unprompted. I personally like to write it down before, so everyone's process is different. But one thing I would recommend if you don't know how to start is write down a bullet list of what you want to say. Maybe it's an outline. Maybe you pick a theme and write a few different ideas under the theme. And then if that works and you have your story, amazing. You can start outlining, maybe practicing saying it out loud. But if that doesn't work, you can think of one of the prompts either in Kate's storytelling workbook or in this presentation, or a question that you would want to be answered, and pretend you're calling a friend, set a timer for 3 minutes, and just start answering it as if you're talking to the person you're closest to in the whole world, or as if you're in a really safe space. And then when the timer goes off, reflect and think, what did I say? What didn't I say? What do I want to talk more about? You could even actually call a trusted person and answer one of the prompts and get feedback from them. Um, Once you're comfortable too, the note at the bottom, that blue thing, is the logo of a company called Otter.io, I think. You can make a free account. I use it every day for recording interviews, and you basically press record and it produces a transcription based off of what you're saying. And then you can stop it and basically read what you wrote. It's not going to be perfect. It's going to get a few words wrong, but it can give you a really good kind of written version of what you said. So that's a great way that, after you talk for 3 minutes, you can look back and see how much time you spent talking about different things and editing it if you want, and then trying it again, thinking about that outline. And then, like I said before, you could talk to a loved one. You could talk to me or somebody in this group about your story. Creativity thrives in community, and there are so many different ways and people that are there to help you as you think about telling yours. I know a lot of times there are people who I maybe are talking to for the first time, or maybe are telling their stories for the first time. It can be really nerve-wracking. And just know that you are in total control and you're also not alone, and can talk about any of your concerns with Kate, or any ideas you want to try or things you're excited about with me or Kate. Um, and then trust yourself. Like I said, your brain knows what makes a good story because that's what we remember. And when you're talking, you can practice if you want, but even if you don't, just make sure you're breathing, you're speaking slowly and loudly, not necessarily like you're amplifying your voice, but just clearly articulating. I can mumble a lot when I'm nervous, so just thinking about um, going slow and being clear can be helpful. And then if you're telling your story and maybe you might get a little bit emotional, just know that you can always take a pause. This a story is not something you need to sprint to, and if it's a little bit over 3 minutes or a little bit under, I'm sure that's perfectly fine. And you can always try again too. If you don't like how it was the first time, that's totally okay. And if you're not comfortable with that format, again, medium matters. Maybe you're a writer and would be more comfortable writing it. There's a place at Lou for that too. And we are open to so many ideas, or I should say, Kate is open to so many ideas. So if you're like, okay, this sounds great, but can I hear an example? Here are some podcasts that I love that are storytelling based. The Moth is one of my favorites. I saw them live when I was in college. They just have a prompt, usually like a one word emotion like love, or they did like scary around Halloween or spooky. And anyone who comes to the recording of the podcast can get on stage and spend 5 minutes telling a story around that theme. So that's a great way to kind of hear the pacing of some people's stories. And it's also, these aren't like professional storytellers, they're just people telling their story. So that's a great way to see what you like from it, see what you don't, and use it to inform your storytelling process. Modern Love is similar, but it's around love. And these are written before, so they're read, but it's still they're great examples of stories within it. And those are selected. So the New York Times or WBUR picks like the best ones. So that's a great resource. StoryCorps, very conversation based, wonderful. They have an app too. And the Story Collider is specifically about science too. And that's a great resource as well. So last thing I'll say for the formal presentation part is don't be a stranger. Here's my email, and I'll give my cell phone number in the chat. Please feel free to reach out for one-on-one coaching if you want someone to just talk through, like, I don't know where to start. I want to brainstorm. I love this kind of stuff. I am all here for it. If you do decide to write it out before and want someone to edit your draft, Again, like I put about before, navigating stage fright, writer's block, nerves. If you want to work on a creative idea, I'm here for that as well. And that's pretty much it. I have this final slide that's just reminding you to like be creative, and I hope you guys feel empowered at the end of this too, to know that your stories can really have a tremendous impact at showing the face of lipodystrophy and getting people to care about it and want to act even more. I really believe, and this is the reason I'm volunteering here, that your stories can change the face of lipodystrophy and inspire the next generation of researchers, patients, and caregivers to lead with empathy, understanding, and innovation. And I am really happy that you guys are all here. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and maybe we can stop the recording and then we can go into the activity.